On to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. We learned that an inmate found unresponsive in a cell at the Burnside Correctional Facility died yesterday. We don't know the circumstances of that death, but we do want to know that he wasn't in an unsafe environment. It reminds us of the 2014 death of an inmate at the very same facility. The FOIPOP Commissioner has determined that the Department of Justice lacks sufficient reason to keep secret documents about that 2014 death. The Premier promised, though, Mr. Speaker, to make Nova Scotia the most open and transparent province in Canada. Will the Premier commit today to releasing the information that the FOIPOP Commissioner says should be public?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. First of all, I want to pass on my condolences to this family, Mr. Speaker. This is a tragedy. This individual was brought into custody. This is not the outcome that anyone wanted, Mr. Speaker. In terms of when it comes to the FOIPOP officer, Mr. Speaker, there's a protocol to go through. There's a process to go through. Different times information is released for different reasons. I don't know why this information wasn't released at the time. But I trust those who work in government to determine what is allowed to be released and what are doing their job.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, like the Premier, the Department of Justice claims to have one of the most open and transparent approaches in this country when it comes to jails. Yet, unlike other provinces, Nova Scotia does not require public inquiries in prison deaths, and the department keeps documents secret, even when the FOIPOP Commissioner says they should be public. I'm sure it is not lost on the Premier that the Commissioner's recommendations are not binding, only because this government refuses to grant her independence. Will the Premier immediately direct the Department to fulfill its promise to be open and transparent by following the recommendations of the FOIPOP Commissioner?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, she's the FOIPOP officer, Mr. Speaker. And further to that point, Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General is a member who has reports to this House. His recommendations, Mr. Speaker, are not binding. We continue to receive them. I want to remind the honourable member we had 10 recommendations around the most recent issue from the FOIPOP officer that we have implemented 9 and looking at the 10th one, Mr. Speaker. Continuing to take those recommendations and how do they best improve public access and public policy.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, let's just admit this government has a problem with transparency. They routinely ignore the recommendations of the FOIPOP Commissioner. They allow the FOIPOP portal to sit inoperative for 5 months, denying Nova Scotians access to information they deserve to see. And this Premier is so averse to revealing documents that he openly admits to taking steps to ensure that certain communications are done in a manner that keeps them out of the hands of the FOIPOP system. My question to the Premier, does he still stand by his statements that he is the most transparent and accountable government, or has he finally come to the realization that just maybe there's only 27 people that believe in him?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I wanted to again remind her, Mr. Speaker, that most recently we were given 10 recommendations around health. Mr. Speaker, I want to remind her that we were given 10 recommendations around health. We've accepted 9 of those. The 10th one is being looked at. I also want to remind her, Mr. Speaker, that website she was referring to did not impede anyone who had a FOIPOP in or information being given out when they were given out. What that website was actually there for, Mr. Speaker, when a FOIPOP was released to the person who actually was receiving the information, we gave a period of time and then we made it available to all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. That's the first time that has happened. We continue to work with making sure that the information that's available and can be available to Nova Scotians is there, Mr. Speaker. It's why we continue to build on open data. I know it's frustrating for the honourable members, but there are certain things, information that we receive, Mr. Speaker, that's not allowed to be put out to the public. It's that simple.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
If a person in Nova Scotia today needs mental health supports, they go in one of 2 directions. If you have benefits from work or a higher income or a private insurance, you can get an appointment right away in one of the private psychological services there are around the province. But if you don't have that kind of access to credit or income or benefits or private insurance, then you need to access the public services of the Nova Scotia Health Authority, and that means a wait of 2, 3, 4, 6, 9, 10, 12 months sometimes in our province. I want to ask the Premier if he will acknowledge that we have a two-tier mental health care system in Nova Scotia today. One
Premier.
for those with resources and one for those who don't.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable for the question. I know he tabled a bill earlier today in its House referring to this very issue, Mr. Speaker. There are many complex challenges with how we provide services, whether it's in the public or private system, and when it comes to the issue of mental health. One of the things he would know, we continue to make sure that the decisions we were making were based on evidence, making sure that we continue to make programs that we put together. Dr. Stan Kuchar has been an important part of those conversations. Star Dobson has been part of those, continuing to make sure that we put the resources in that he's referring to provide those services today, but also dealing with the evidence-based information that we have, that we know that if we continue to put that wraparound service around our young people in schools, we can identify the challenges earlier on, and the outcomes, Mr. Speaker, are much, much better.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
40% of people don't have the kind of benefits that will access counselling services for them. And there was a report a couple of years ago from the Canadian Psychological Association that said that in Nova Scotia, 50% of the need for counselling services is at the moment going unmet. So can the Premier tell us, is he satisfied with a system where, in effect, every second person is not getting the counselling services that they need because they haven't got the money?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, continue to work with our partners on evidence-based solutions to the challenges facing Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the issue of mental health. Said to the Honourable Member, we know there's more work to do. We're going to continue to make improvements to the system. It will be based on evidence, Mr. Speaker. It's simply not the idea, as the Honourable Member would suggest, that we just throw money at the challenge, Mr. Speaker. Every healthcare provider will tell you that's not the solution. The solution is making sure that when we make these investments, it's around evidence. That's why we've made the investments in the wraparound service we're providing in schools. There's clear evidence that the earlier we can address the issues facing young Nova Scotians, the better it is for outcomes for them as they continue to grow through adolescence and into adulthood.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
What there is evidence of, Mr. Speaker, is that all kinds of other jurisdictions in Canada are moving ahead by leaps and bounds with the vision with which they are addressing mental health, and Nova Scotia is being left behind. In Newfoundland or in PEI, you can walk in on a same-day basis and receive counselling services anytime. In Quebec, they've got a superlative suicide prevention program they made investments in. Ontario is spending more than almost twice what we are as a percentage of their health care on mental health care. So I want to ask the Premier if he will acknowledge that in the last 5 years, when it comes to the mental health emergency, here we in Nova Scotia, under this government's leadership, have fallen way behind.
The Honourable Premier.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. As I said to him earlier, and I'll say it again in this answer, Mr. Speaker, the decisions that we make around the investments we make in healthcare, particularly around mental health, will be evidence-based. It's why we've taken the recommendations of healthcare providers to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we put in place programs that have early detection, identifying the challenges, and making sure then at that point we are providing those services so as they move through adolescence into adulthood, Mr. Speaker, we've dealt with the challenges they are facing.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Questions for the Premier, Mr. Speaker. 2014, the PC Caucus Office submitted a FOIPOP request to the Department of Community Services asking for information about the government's decision to cancel Phase 3 of the Riverview Adult Residential Facility in Pictou County. Our office received a heavily redacted document, and we appealed the government's heavy-handed approach to keep information such a secret. The FOIPOP Commissioner agreed with us, saying that to automatically keep draft documents a secret is using advice to the minister exemption too broadly. Despite all of this, the department said it would not abide by the FOIPOP Commissioner's ruling. Why would a government that promised to be the most open and transparent government in Canada ignore the ruling of the FOIPOP Commissioner and withhold, Mr. Speaker, information that should be made public?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the FOIPOP officer, Mr. Speaker, continues to make recommendations to our government. We take those recommendations seriously, Mr. Speaker. One of the challenges departments, particularly Department of Community Service, like Department of Health, is giving very sensitive information about individuals. In that, they make decisions based on ensuring they're protecting the identity of the people who are either in the care or requiring support from us in the province. And we're going to continue to make sure that we continue to put the information that we have that we can release, we will release, and the information that is believed to be information that shouldn't be out in the public that we need to protect, we will.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
The Privacy Commissioner said that the government's heavy-handed approach in this case was entirely inconsistent with the purpose of FOIPOP and the well-established approach that FOIPOP legislation be broadly interpreted in favour of disclosure. In June, the government said it would actually release the information to our caucus office approximately 30 days. As of this morning, Mr. Speaker, our office still had not received any information, but we checked. The government said they were still working on it, more than 60 days after they promised to release the information. Will the Premier please lift the veil of secrecy in this case and release the information about Rev Review?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The privacy officer, I'm sure, would also tell the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, that more than 80% of the requests that come in to our office, Mr. Speaker, our government, are sent out, which is when you look across the country, Mr. Speaker, is continually an impressive number. We know there's still more work to do. She would also know, many members of her caucus who have been in government would also know some of the requests require a lot of detail. There's a lot of pieces of paper that are part of that. That takes time to gather, so there's some of those that go beyond. We look for extensions. How do we make that? But on the same, what she's referring to now, Mr. Speaker, is a documentation that would have gone through by people within the department who wouldn't have released the information because of the sensitivity associated with some of that information, is my understanding. So now the FOIPOP officer has made a recommendation. We still need to go through to make sure that that information that is sensitive, Mr. Speaker, that is personal, that is should not be out in the public domain, does not go in the public domain.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. Nearly 7 years ago, under a previous government, I'm sure the Minister can figure out which one that was, a 5-year mental health and addiction strategy was developed, Mr. Speaker, so that government could make measurable progress on improving access to assessment, treatment, care and support around the province. That strategy needed to be updated and renewed over a year ago, and this government hasn't done so yet, Mr. Speaker. So I asked the Minister, why hasn't the government updated the 5-year mental health and addiction strategy, which was produced almost 7 years ago?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for raising this important question. In fact, the strategy has helped inform the work that's been done by government and our partners, both the community providers of mental health services and our health authorities, for actions and investments. That work continues, as well as government has had a number of other sources of recommendations to improve mental health services. Work is underway. In fact, very near future, we'll have a next phase ready to go out the door, but we do have the information and an action plan around mental health. Again, we haven't stopped to wait for the updated strategic plan. We've been taking action based on recommendations from professionals on the front line all along.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the most important part of that strategy was to hold government to account, no matter who is in office, Mr. Speaker. We know that there are important parts of the original strategy that are still incomplete. To our knowledge, the work on reviewing mental health services to make sure that they are effective with sex, gender, and diversity in mind still has not begun, Mr. Speaker, and the province is still not collecting and monitoring data related to alcohol, drug use, and gambling. So I'd like to ask the Minister, can the Minister explain why this work has not been a priority for his department, and when will that information and that part of the strategy begin, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The work around the recommendations and the strategy have been ongoing throughout the lifespan, but we haven't stopped there, Mr. Speaker. As a government, we've identified that mental health and addictions is a very important pillar of our healthcare system. We've been investing heavily, recognizing in particular the needs and the value of investing in youth mental health initiatives. We've taken those steps, Mr. Speaker. We haven't stood still. We've invested. We've worked with frontline professionals and experts in the area. We've received recommendations from numerous sources, including a panel on mental health services that reported to the Minister of Health. We've seen these as foundations for the work that we've been doing and will continue to do in this space.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, some days it seemed like the government never met a privacy recommendation that it didn't ignore. This week, Privacy Commissioner Catherine Tully expressed extreme disappointment in the response to the Minister to recommendations her office made in the wake of a pharmacy data breach. As we now know, a pharmacist reviewed dozens of private client records that should never have been accessed. Mrs. Tully made several significant recommendations to safeguard pharmacy records in the future. The vast majority were ignored. She suggested a protocol to investigate anonymous tips so that future breaches can be identified sooner. That was ignored. And she asked the Department of Health and Wellness 3 times to meet with her to discuss the report. And again, she was ignored. And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister is, what excuse could the Minister possibly have for refusing to meet with the Privacy Commissioner to discuss better safeguards for medical data?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the member's question about the allegations that the department refused to meet with the Privacy Review Officer and her staff throughout the preparation of the response. Fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, the Privacy Review Officer submitted a report and recommendations in late July. The process has the department and prepare a response to that within 30 days. That work was undertaken. The Privacy Review Office did contact the department and indicate that they would make themselves available should we have questions or clarification required. Mr. Speaker, if the member opposite would care to read the report and recommendations provided by the Privacy Review Officer, the recommendations are very clear and didn't require further clarification.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, it's increasingly clear to me that this government isn't forced to do something in the best interest of Nova Scotians. It won't bother. Legislation required the Minister's Department respond to Tully's recommendation within 30 days, which they did. But there's no legislation that requires the Department to enact transparency safeguards like making user activity data available to the Privacy Commissioner. So it should come as no surprise that the Department waves it off with the phrase, "It's under consideration." Mr. Speaker, this government has repeatedly demonstrated it cannot be trusted with sensitive personal data, yet it refuses to take steps to fix the situation. So my question to the ministers, when will this government end its policy of secrecy, stop treating privacy like a joke, and give the Office of the Privacy Commissioner the teeth it needs to protect all Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I assure the member opposite, all members of this legislature, and indeed all Nova Scotians, that we do take the concerns and the responsibilities of maintaining personal health information very seriously, Mr. Speaker. That's why we have taken steps, in fact, have already implemented many of the recommendations from July's report. We didn't wait, Mr. Speaker, until I completed my response to that report within the 30 days provided. We actually started taking action right away, Mr. Speaker. So several of the recommendations we've already implemented, and others continue to be in progress.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question today is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. On September 7th, 2018, the town of Oxford wrote the Minister asking for assistance regarding the sinkhole that has developed at the Oxford Area Lions Park. As of this morning, the Mayor has still not received official word from the Minister. The costs have been adding up and are only going to increase as time and source of the problem are determined. Addressing this problem without assistance from the province has been draining on the town's reserves, which I'll table their document. I've also sent a letter to the Minister on September 10th requesting assistance. I'll table that document. My question, is the Minister willing to work with the town of Oxford and the Oxford Lions community to seek provincial, federal funding to help alleviate this issue?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can confirm I did receive some correspondence from the town of Oxford. We have been in touch with the CAO for the town. We've asked for some further information around costs associated with the challenges they are having managing this issue, Mr. Speaker, and we have committed to them that we will certainly look at how we can support them going forward with this particular next phase of their assessment. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cumberland South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you to the Minister for that commitment. But as we know, the cost of this sinkhole itself will continue to cause problems for this small town until a resolution can be found. The town will not be able to continue with the ongoing expenditures without the assistance of provincial or federal government assistance. The Hansport Abattoir is a prime example of how a situation can deteriorate when the province tries to figure out a solution to fix it. Will the Minister commit today to the town of Oxford and the Oxford Area Lions Centre to ensure they fully support it until this issue is resolved?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. As I stated in my first answer, we've certainly reached out to the town of Oxford. We'll continue to work with them. We have asked them for a quote on what the next phase may cost. And we're certainly willing to work with them and support them as we are able going forward until the issue is resolved. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Over the last 2 weeks, the community of Oxford has been dealing with the sudden, indefinite closure of the Oxford Regional Education Centre. My colleague from Cumberland South facilitated a town hall on September 4th so parents could express their many concerns. We know because of mortar issues at the 8-year-old school, students are being sent over 25 kilometres away to Pugwash. Some parents in Oxford are so frustrated with the Education Centre's sluggish response to this matter that they are refusing to send their children that far to classes, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. Now, to his credit, the Minister has acknowledged the obvious, that a school this new shouldn't be shut down for structural issues. My question is this: when will engineers have completed their assessment of the structural flaws at the Oxford Regional Education Centre, and when will parents get the detailed information on the status of their school? Thank you,
Honourable
Mr.
Minister
Speaker.
of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, the situation is an unfortunate one. I recognize the inconvenience and frustration that parents and students are experiencing. We have a mandate, though, to ensure that they're safe when they're entering into one of our buildings. We have obviously asked the engineers who are looking at the situation for us to expedite this process as quickly as possible without reducing the quality of their work in assessing these issues. And as soon as we have more information, Mr. Speaker, we'll be communicating that to the public. I know that the members opposite hosted one town hall. The Regional Centre for Education also hosted 3 town halls and have been doing their very best to keep parents and community members up to speed on this file as it progresses.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, it's one thing for parents, students and staff in this school to know in advance that their school will be out of commission for a couple weeks. But it's the sudden nature of this whole situation that really concerns everyone involved. The community only found out about this dangerous structural issue days before school was to start, forcing everyone to make alternative arrangements. And the minister indicates his department isn't aware of similar issues at other schools built within the last 10 years. My question is this: has the minister's department confirmed with TIR what the structural issues are and whether other schools built around the same time as Oxford Regional have similar structural issues?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. TIR is on site. We did send the deputy down. They've conducted evaluations. We're also looking for a third-party independent to provide us with some further assessments, and with the goal of getting our kids back to school after we identify the extent of these issues as quickly as possible. Mr. Speaker, I know this is an inconvenience. I know the lack of a timeline is problematic for people, but the fact is we communicated to the public as soon as we were made aware of these issues, and we'll keep the public and parents updated as information comes in real time. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. The prisoners at the Burnside Jail have just ended their 20-day strike. In a statement today, they say, quote, "It is with heavy hearts we write that shortly after the end of our protest, a fellow prisoner incarcerated here lost his life. The conditions and environment here speak for themselves. Since the protests started, we have been locked down with even less time spent outside, in contact with our families, or getting any recreation. We know how these conditions hurt the mental health of people imprisoned here. Mr. Speaker, will the minister admit that conditions in our provincial correctional facilities are dangerously harming the mental health of the Nova Scotians imprisoned there?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. The circumstances most recently in the passing of an inmate are tragic, and our hearts and prayers go out to the family members who are grieving. With regards to the facility, Mr. Speaker, there's a significant amount of change taking place in the facility. That change is very progressive. It's implementing new strategies, expanding programs, it's providing services to inmates. Is there more work to do, Mr. Speaker? Absolutely, and we're committed to doing that work.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, the prisoners at the Burnside Jail, the majority of whom, I will remind you, are still awaiting trial, have been calling for access to mental health treatment. They describe having medications summarily cut off, delays in being able to access necessary medications, not having access to appropriate medical professionals, and not receiving compassionate care. Mr. Speaker, as the striking prisoners so eloquently stated, medical treatment is a right. Being deprived of health care is not a part of our sentences. Mr. Speaker, will the minister commit today to immediate action to improve access to mental health care for prisoners?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleague would know we had an opportunity to tour the facility. She's very aware, Mr. Speaker, of the forensic side of the facility and the mental health programs that are available there, both on the forensic side, Mr. Speaker, but also on the custodial side. We recognize these are important programs, Mr. Speaker. There is health care services available within this facility on a frequent basis. My colleague speaks about the delay in some of the appointments. That does happen, Mr. Speaker. That's based on the availability of corrections officers to ensure the safety of those who are providing health care services within that environment. That is our priority, Mr. Speaker, the public health and safety of all who find themselves within that particular facility.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation. Last spring I met with representatives of his department to go over the plan for filling potholes this year. They committed to spending a week in Kings North followed by a week in Kings South with the plan of having the work mostly done in May and June. However, very little pothole filling was done in May and June, and by mid-July, I was receiving so many complaints from my constituents that I sent off an email to the Deputy Minister and a letter to the Minister. My question for the Minister is, will the Minister please update this House and the residents of Kings North about why it took so long for pothole filling to get underway this year?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the member opposite, and I will confirm that he has been talking to our department and to me about the issues in his constituency. The easiest answer to that, Mr. Speaker, is that we have 23,000 kilometres of roads in the province, and we have a lot of potholes that we're filling constantly. And the thing about potholes is that they reoccur, Mr. Speaker. They happen, they go away, we fill them, they come back. So we actually are looking at technology on a wider scale that might help us with that problem. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I will confirm that is true. There are a lot of potholes. Mr. Speaker, a week after my email, the Deputy Minister toured my area, and then later a tender came out from for Kings County for RIM. In that tender, Kings North has gotten some attention. However, it is now September and they are still filling potholes and likely will not finish filling potholes in Kings North this year. As in most other years, it never actually, they get to them all. And I believe it is a question of lack of resources. My question for the Minister, can the Minister assure the people of Kings North that potholes will be filled earlier next year by having a dedicated crew for Kings North and a separate dedicated crew for Kings South?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm very pleased to remind the House that in the current budget that we're operating on, we saw significant increases in the capital budget and in the operating budget for the first time in many, many years, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the ongoing battle we have with our road system, which is one of the oldest road systems in Nova Scotia because of our rich history of settlement, it's a constant battle for us to undertake to get the problems done. And the issues are not only in Kings North, they're in every part of the province, and we'll continue to work dedicatedly towards fixing them. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. This past July, Doctors Chris Elliott and Tom Park, who operate the Aberdeen Walk-In Clinic, announced that they would be temporarily closing their clinic on August 5th. The closure was the result of a lack of physicians to cover the clinic's operating hours. Unwilling to further jeopardize the primary patient care of Pictou County residents, the doctors now have decided, as of today, to reopen the clinic, though their concerns about doctor recruitment and compensation remain. Can the Minister please provide an update on the doctor recruitment efforts for Pictou County?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to advise the member I appreciate the work of the physicians operating the Aberdeen Walk-In Clinic. In fact, I met with them earlier this summer when they expressed their concerns of the situation. We discussed what their concerns were. Staff within the Health Authority and the department continue to work with them. But as far as the compensation and recruitment efforts, not just for Pictou County, but for all of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, continues to be listening to physicians about what works. We've made significant investments in March based upon feedback and input from Doctors Nova Scotia, which saw an increase in compensation for comprehensive family care, as well as incentives to attach more patients to practices. We've invested in residency positions, Mr. Speaker, so there's a lot more going on. I can continue as we move into the second part of the question.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the Minister. He did meet, and I appreciate that. Doctors Elliott and Park understand the needs of their patients and don't want to worsen the state of healthcare accessibility in Pictou County. Our healthcare system, as we all know, is in a crisis, and it is a sad statement, Mr. Speaker, that the doctors are doing more to try and solve the problem than this government. Without a family doctor, more and more Nova Scotians rely on walk-in clinics for their care, but the province has chosen to leave these clinics out of their enhanced fee regime. I'd like to ask the Minister, after that meeting, I realized that you indicated to them that you said the door was not closed. So could you please update me with what communication you have had with them recently?
I'd like to remind the Honourable Member to keep her questions directed through the Chair. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and appreciate the question. The member's correct. At the conclusion of the meeting, I'd indicated the door's not closed. What I did indicate was explaining why the changes in compensation were targeted at comprehensive family care practices, Mr. Speaker, because that's what Doctors Nova Scotia brought to our attention and recommended was that it is that type of environment that will serve the patients of Nova Scotia, the residents of Nova Scotia. It will be the recruitment and retention mechanism that was not to extend that increase in compensation to the walk-in clinic services, which are more transactional in nature rather than having people attached to a clinic. The work that's been ongoing with the physicians in this case was to look to see can the work being provided, the services being provided at that walk-in clinic be reconstituted in such a way that they fulfill the requirements to be comprehensive family care. And if that can be achieved, they would be eligible for the compensation fee.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, my local regional hospital has been under great strain due to the loss of several specialists and family doctors. The shortage has been across many specialties, namely anesthesia, internal medicine, psychiatry, obstetrics, and emergency care. The reasons the docs are giving for leaving vary, from licensing rules and regulations to frustration due to poor management within the Health Authority. There is an anti-physician culture in the Nova Scotia Health Authority. The people of Cumberland North and throughout the province need access to doctors now. They can't wait for years for residents to be trained. My question to the Minister of Health is, what measures is he taking to change this anti-physician culture that's leading to physicians leaving Amherst, Pugwash, and across the entire province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. Pleased to highlight that list of challenging specialist positions that the member highlighted. In fact, just earlier this morning, I was joined representatives of Dalhousie Medical School to announce the 15 specialist residency positions that will be commencing this July. That those positions fill those very areas that the member has highlighted, Mr. Speaker. We know where the challenges are. We are taking steps to address them, and I'd like to assure the member that when residents are completing their training, they are actually providing care to their patients, Mr. Speaker. You're not waiting for care when residents come into the province to perform their training. You're getting the care when they hit the training.
The Honourable Leader, Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, in August, over 900 people of Amherst and Pugwash met and rallied to have their voices heard about the poor healthcare conditions. Many local doctors spoke about the challenges they are facing, and one shared that she had just finished 21 days on call herself, 24/7. But the working nurses were not heard. Why? Because they were muzzled. They were told they were not allowed to attend the rally, and they weren't allowed to speak. Residents of Cumberland North deserve to hear from all healthcare professionals. We live in Canada, a democracy. My question to Minister of Health is, why have you taken away the democratic rights of nurses to speak publicly? Nurses should not be muzzled.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, to clarify the record, in no way did I muzzle nurses in Cumberland or anywhere else in the province. Mr. Speaker, in fact, the nurses in Cumberland earlier this year, I met with them to hear their concerns, and following that meeting, there have been changes made to the medical unit in that facility based upon the concerns they brought forward. The Health Authority took those concerns forward, and they adjusted the staffing as the nurses in that facility requested. Mr. Speaker, we listen to our frontline healthcare workers, and we make changes where and when we can.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question today is for the Minister responsible for the status of women. In the past few days, we've heard some awful examples of the service gaps that exist across the province for people who have experienced sexual violence, including the absolutely unacceptable case of the woman in Truro who was allegedly turned away from the hospital with only a pamphlet. These gaps will only widen as programs previously supported by the sexual violence strategy come to an end, and appropriate and ongoing investment in therapeutic counselling is critical to supporting the growing number of survivors coming forward. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister: of the $1 million budgeted to continue the work of the sexual violence strategy this year, how much will go towards therapeutic counselling for survivors?
The Honourable Minister responsible for the status of women.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and I would like to say that we have certain expectations when we go and we ask for help when we go to a hospital or a health facility, and unfortunately sometimes those aren't met, and I was dismayed to hear that had happened. I do want to let the honourable member know that the continuing money that is available for the sexual violence strategy is in the area of prevention, and we've been very clear about that. And we were also very clear when the money was being rolled out during the sexual violence strategy that any monies were not to be for ongoing programs beyond that, including there were some indications, I believe, along the way that some counselling was being done, but we were very clear at the time that the money rolled out that this was not to be for multi-year funding for that purpose. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that response. As a survivor myself, I know how important it is to have sexual assault services available when they're needed in communities right across the province. There's a growing demand for trauma-specific therapeutic counseling programs to help survivors, and earlier this year, the Sexual Assault Services Network of Nova Scotia identified the funding of 13 new therapeutic counseling programs as a first priority. So, Mr. Speaker, is the minister willing to provide ongoing funding for the 13 new therapeutic counseling programs to meet the present and growing need for these services? And would she commit today to working with me and the Minister of Health to make sure that Truro is added to the list of communities set to next receive a sexual assault nurse examiner?
The Honourable Minister responsible for the status of women.
I'm always more than happy to work with my colleagues across the floor to improve services to women in this province, and I'm always very happy to work with the Minister of Health on any issue. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, last session I extended a few invitations to the Minister to join me at a healthcare rally in North Sydney. The Minister did not see fit to accept and to join us. He did come to town sometime later to close the Northside General and the Waterford Consolidated Hospital. Or should I say, as more accurately, he watched silently as the Premier announced the closures of these hospitals. On September 23rd, there will be another rally in North Sydney, and I'd like to invite the Minister to attend. They're not asking politicians to speak, so this should be right up his alley, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister, will you join me at this rally on September 23rd in North Sydney?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member knows, what took place in June is that we went to Cape Breton. We highlighted the investments we're going to be making.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
We highlighted the investments we're going to be making, Mr. Speaker, to move healthcare services in the Cape Breton region forward. This is seeing investments in both New Waterford, North Sydney, as well as expansion of the emergency room, cancer centre at the Cape Breton Regional, and other investments in Glace Bay as well, Mr. Speaker. We're investing in the future of healthcare for Cape Bretoners and all Nova Scotians. We'll continue that work.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, we didn't come to do those announcements. The Premier made that announcement. We sat silently while the Premier made that announcement. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of the rally is for the community to express their concerns about the state of healthcare today and their concerns about the future of 2 fewer hospitals in our area. The Minister is working on a plan for the delivery of health care in the area, and the residents are anxious to know what that plan is. I know I've said the politicians aren't invited to speak, but if the Minister wanted to share his plan, I'm sure we can make that exception. So my question to the Minister, will the Minister come to North Sydney, share his plan for health care at the Cape Breton hospitals? Yes or no? And I don't need a long answer, just yes or no, so the people will know if he's coming or not.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been very clear. We've been very clear as to the work that's ongoing in the Cape Breton region, Mr. Speaker, in particular North Side and New Waterford, North Sydney and New Waterford, Mr. Speaker. That includes investments in new primary care facilities, an expansion, a doubling of nursing home beds, long-term care space there, Mr. Speaker, expansion in the Cape Breton Regional as well as the Glace Bay hospitals, Mr. Speaker. We've been very clear on that. There is more work to be done to work out specific details, Mr. Speaker. That's the functional plan, and that work is underway right now.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development. The Minister knows that there have been rough spots at the beginning of this year, for sure. And a lot of calls are coming into my office. One parent phoned saying that a child was expected to walk a half an hour just to get to a bus stop. The other examples came in of rural students, many who are 5- and 6-year-olds, needing to walk the shoulders of busy streets, higher speed limits, no traffic lights, no crossing guards, and most importantly, no sidewalks. And I promised to bring these concerns to the Minister, and I'm doing that now. As the stock transportation contract is being evaluated, can the Minister offer assurance that busing the rural routes will receive the extra considerations required to ensure safety and timely delivery of our children?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. I appreciate that too many families have experienced frustrations and uncertainties with busing, particularly in the Halifax area. We've instructed them to put additional resources on the ground to sort those immediate issues out, so our kids are getting to and from school. I am happy to report that we are at about 98% now of our students in HRM who are getting to and from school on time, but we know we need to do better, and that's why we're going to review busing policies, best practices within this province and other provincial jurisdictions to make sure that we are doing our very best from a policy and regulatory framework perspective. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musqueam, Valley.
The other concern I have is that the parents are calling Stock Transportation to find out what is going on, to try and get some explanations or answers. And they have not been receiving the responses from Stock Transportation. So my question is, will the minister create a reliable avenue where these concerns can be lodged, recorded, reviewed, and addressed in an appropriate manner?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We did get concerns coming into the department that parents were unable to speak with people when they were calling Stock Transportation phone lines. We did instruct the region, however, to provide telephone number and communication information to all parents in HRM directly into the region's office so that they would talk to a person directly and those folks would help them deal with the issues that they were dealing with in terms of knowing where the buses were and making sure that their kids were getting on there on time.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Education. 15 months ago, the Minister of Education halted the school review process for Cole Harbour High, Auburn Drive High, and all its feeder schools. In spite of my non-stop year-long efforts to raise this issue in the legislature, the media, and the endless emails I sent to the minister refused to speak to the fate of these schools. Last Friday, the minister sent out a letter to the parents and teachers advising them all that he was taking no action on the schools in the short term. This neither surprised nor reassured parents and students nor myself, and they still have no idea what's going to happen a year from now. Can the minister tell me what he intends to do with the SOC recommendations, as well as the recommendations in the report that the school board never had a chance to release?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we've had several meetings with the SACs from both those school communities that have involved members from Dartmouth and Cole Harbour as well, and Preston. And those meetings went well, and in fact, we communicated to each and every parent in the school community that we would be following through on the school review committee's recommendation to keep both schools open, Mr. Speaker, and there will be an announcement in the very near future in terms of what the future services provided at those schools will look like, and I think it'll be really positive information for the students and for the broader community in those areas.
The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
With all due respect, Mr. Speaker, the SOC report recommended a whole lot more than just keeping a couple of high schools open, so they're not reassured. It is outrageous to me that the minister and his government can bring in legislation dissolving an entire level of government but can't get kids to school on time. It's outrageous that they can take principals out of unions and restructure the entire school administration, but they can't tell my constituents in my area or neighbouring constituencies what's going to happen in their schools next year. So I'm going to ask the minister once again a question I asked him a year ago that he said yes to but then didn't follow up on. Will the minister meet with me and the principals of Cole Harbour High, Auburn Drive High, and the new Island View High Schools to begin the discussions on the future of the education services in Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage, and beyond? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, we have made transformative changes in the education system that the member has referenced. We've done that because we know we have been failing our students. We have not allowed them to achieve their greatest potential in our school system, and we haven't provided our teachers the support that they need to do their job to the fullest of their potential, Mr. Speaker. And every single time we have brought in these changes that we know are needed to improve student achievement and well-being, the opposition party has fought for the status quo. They have fought against those changes, Mr. Speaker. So I'm proud to actually be part of a government that's working with communities to make these changes that are long overdue. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, autism is not a mental health disorder or issue in and of itself, However, just like everyone else, people on the autism spectrum suffer from mood disorders and experience psychological distress, and they deserve access to supportive services and treatment. Mr. Speaker, our caucus was recently informed by an advocacy group that people with an autism diagnosis are being screened out of eligibility for community-based mental health counselling services. These individuals are being referred to mental health services by their family physicians, showing up at their choice appointments months later, and upon disclosing their ASD status, being informed that they are not eligible for counselling services because of it. Mr. Speaker, can the minister offer any explanation as to why people with ASD are being discriminated against when it comes to accessing mental health care?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for bringing this concern to the floor of the legislature. As she noted, that was information that was brought to her attention from an advocacy group. I'm not aware of that information. If she'd like to forward it on to me, I'll certainly look into it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers. We'll now move on to opposition business. The Honourable House